My name is Chloe. I'm the Equity Officer of the Manchester Debating Union and I'll be chairing tonight's debate. The motion before the House is this House believes that feminism should exclude men. Today's speakers include, on proposition, we have Jess Lyshat, who's the Women's Officer for the University of Manchester's Students' Union. And Ali Fogg, a journalist for The Guardian with a special interest in gender issues. On the opposition today, we have Dr. Liberty Barnes, a research associate in sociology at the University of Cambridge and an author. And Becky Montague, the president of the MDU, currently studying a PhD in neuroscience.
In feminism, we often talk about equality. It is, after all, the definition quoted in Beyonce's song Flawless, the social, political and economic equality of the sexes. Although for me that's what feminism aims to achieve, it is not what feminism is. For me, equality can only come through liberation. That is to say, the removal of the structural oppression that women experience in nearly every aspect of everyday life, either subconsciously or consciously. This structural oppression benefits men while disadvantaging women. The power structures that teach women that when they are raped, it's their fault, that their bodies as objects are more important than their personality, and that we must shrink our bodies and voices to make way for those of men's. It is these power structures that allow 2 men a week to murder their wives and girlfriends, that allow men to be paid 17.8% more than women counterparts, and that allow women to make up 80% of professors at our university, while women students make up 56%. These structural powers, though not created by individual men, ultimately benefit men and are upheld by men. In the words of Audre Lorde, I believe that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We have had centuries of men in power, men at the top, and men with the tools and abilities to create long-lasting positive change. They could have brought around the equality of the sexes, but that just hasn't happened. It's our turn. In the power structures and the media of our society, men dominate and take up disproportionate amount of space. If you want a visual representation of this, go on the Tumblr, men taking up too much space on the tube. Emma Watson, in her recent address to the UN, kindly invited men to the table to discuss feminism. Unfortunately, her invitation was a little bit awkward because men have been hosting and dominating the table for many, many years. They are 94% of our CEOs, 77% of journalists and 75% of MPs. Men have been involved in the discussions around women's rights for years, and these discussions have led to women in Britain having to persuade 2 doctors that they want to have an abortion, 60% rape conviction rates once in court, but only an 11% rape report rate, and violence against women and girl services that save lives being disproportionately cut by the government. Following Emma Watson's address, it's transpired that Iceland are planning to host a men's-only feminist conference. While their intentions might be honourable, and they might come to some productive conclusions, if a couple of women's issues are dealt with in a room with men with a closed door, are we really making any progress? It's still a decision-making power and autonomy taken away from women, who feminism aims to liberate and empower. I don't find it empowering at all. Men don't get to sit in a room and define what problems women face in society and how to deal with it because they don't have those experiences. And it's not like there aren't countless feminist conferences and discussions going on with women leading them. The idea of this conference ignores and actively undermines all of those women. When men become involved in feminism, we often find that feminism is once again reduced to the concept of inequality rather than liberation. Focusing on inequality with the inclusion of men changes the parameters of the conversation. Instead of talking about issues women face and how to solve them, men become the centre of attention. Take this debate for an example. Although it might not appear that we're talking about feminism, we're not. It's discussing men. It's resolving around men and their emotions, their wants and their experiences. It's not about the oppression of women face and the experiences that affect our lives. It's whether men should play a key role in the movement. In this debate, the topic of men dominates and it takes up a disproportionate amount of space. Public spaces in our society are constructed to be men's spaces instead, which you will know oh too well if you're a woman and have been catcalled, heckled, shouted at, told to smile, smacked, groped, harassed and assaulted by men on the streets, on the buses and in our clubs. Similarly, seemingly gender-neutral discussions are usually actually discussions about how men interpret or feel about subjects. Unless stated otherwise, men are taking up the norm for how people feel in discussions on the news, in the papers, in our parliament. Feminism and the liberation of women can only succeed if one of two things happen. Men give up their power and space, or women take it back. Men giving up their power is backing off, allowing women's voices to be heard and listening to what women need in order to remove oppression. Men who wish to bring about equality must recognise that in everyday lives their voices are dominant, and this is the time that it takes to take a step back, be quiet, give women the space to organise and converse and listen to what we're saying. Being a good feminist ally as a man and aiming to bring about equality involves recognition that there is an imbalance of power, and it's not addressed by asserting yourself more, imposing yourself and your views on people in more spaces. Women-only spaces empower women. They increase confidence and reflexivity, as well as provide a safe space for debate and to challenge stereotypes, not to mention allowing discussion for highly emotive and distressing topics such as violence against women, rape and assault. The removal of spaces for self-defining women has detrimental effects on women's abilities to communicate and engage safely with each other. One of the arguments for having men involved in feminism is that it's unfair and unkind to exclude men from the conversation. However, in the unfair sweepstakes, the reality of male sexual, physical and emotional violence is slightly worse than them not being the centre of the conversation. Liberating women from these structures should be the goal of feminism, not worrying about whether or not men's feelings are hurt. Of course, men are impacted by gender roles and expectations, and I'm not trying to say that testicular cancer, mental health issues and the really high male suicide rate aren't important and don't need to be tackled. Of course they do. I'm saying that feminism might not be the place to discuss these issues. They are gender related, but they don't result from countless years of structural oppression, and these issues do not give men the right to hijack women's liberation and the little space that we've carved for ourselves in society. Men, there is a role for you with plenty that you can do, and I really hope that you'll be influenced by feminism, and that influence is a recognition that women's voices should be valued and that you should take a step back, allowing us to find these voices and allow us to express them and empower ourselves, and that you do not need to be dominating or leading in feminist issues. It also needs to be a recognition that you shouldn't be involved in all of the conversations. Sometimes you have a place, but a lot of the times you don't. I hope that when you leave here, you begin to recognise when you talk over women in seminars or dismiss a point that a woman makes before wholeheartedly agreeing the same point that comes out of a man's mouth, or that you close your bloody legs on public transport. It's time that you shut up and listen, allow us to reclaim our voices and liberate ourselves. Thanks.
To be here today. It's an absolute pleasure. I begin my remarks with a short autobiographical anecdote. In 2012, my husband and I boarded a train with our 4 small children in San Jose, California. It was Martin Luther King Jr. Day in America, and around the country, people were boarding trains to commemorate the freedom rides of the Civil Rights era. My husband and I took great care before the ride to teach our children about Martin Luther King Jr., the American Civil Rights Movement, and the historic freedom riders we were honoring. The train took us to San Francisco, where all of us freedom riders led a march for a mile through the streets of the city. My son, just 9 at the time, said to me, "Mom, why are we the only white people here?" I looked around at the throngs of people, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Africans, Pacific Islanders, waving banners and pushing baby prams, and my heart sank. He was right. Within our field of sight, with the exception of the occasional white friend or partner, it appeared we were the only white family marching that day. Do I think blacks need whites? No. Do I think that if blacks and whites are going to live in the same society together, they should be united in the cause of universal civil rights? Absolutely. This house believes feminism should exclude men, but the woman standing before you believes that feminism should include men. Do I think that women need men? No. Do I think that if women and men are going to coexist in a social world, they should all be dedicated to gender equality? Absolutely. I have spoken in feminist debates before, and I always put forth this same definition of feminism. Feminism is not a list of grievances. Feminism is a lens through which we see the world. Feminism is a perspective based on the belief that all humans are equal, that each has inherent value regardless of their gender. And today I would add that as more people acquire a feminist perspective, we may witness a real social movement. Mr. Ali Fogg, in his piece, The Trouble with Male Feminism, in The Guardian, wrote, "Feminism can cope without me, I'm sure, and will be all the stronger for doing so." Now, to be fair, if Mr. Fogg and I were to meet in any other circumstances, I'm sure we'd be great friends. But since we're meeting here in this debate today, we are sworn enemies for life. Can feminism cope without you, Mr. Fogg? Of course. You're special, but you're not that special. The broader question is, can feminism, as a worldview that moves society toward gender equality, succeed if all our male politicians refuse to join the movement? Do I want to be married to a man that refuses to be a feminist? Do I want to work with men who refuse to think like feminists? What about my family doctor, or my children's school teachers, or the men I share space with in the grocery store and public transportation? Mr. Fogg has complained that feminist men have to take their cues from women and sit in the pew of the feminist cathedral. Yeah, that's how it works. I didn't show up at the commemorative freedom ride and say, well, you black folks think you know what you need, but I'm here to tell you what your rights should look like. Do you know what race relations look like in America right now? From the pictures on the news of Ferguson, Missouri, it looks like a war zone. 150 years since Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and 50 years since the March on Washington, and whites in America still can't be bothered to get their butts out of bed on a national holiday and join a freedom march. What whites really can't be bothered to do is listen and care, and to make issues that matter to other people matter to them. Yes, men, we are asking you to listen and to care, and to align your priorities with feminist priorities, to take on a feminist lens. And once you do, you are enlisted in the cause. By the way, Mr. Fogg, that line about women, about you will be stronger for doing so, are you my dad? That's a line I feed to my children when I don't want to get off the couch and help them with their homework. So it sounds like you're saying, okay, you women, you go solve all the world's problems and come back and check in with me and I'll let you know if you got the answers right. My message today is, men, get off the couch. Now I want to direct my comments to the women in the room that believe feminism should exclude men. What are you, the gender police? Are you checking everyone's primary and secondary sex characteristics at the door? Are you going to hire a bouncer to kick out all the flat-chested folks? What about the flat-chested women, or the men with man boobs? What about the intersexed, the queer, the trans men, the trans women? What about the women who love motorcycles or physics, and the men who love dancing and caring for children? Feminism is categorically not in the business of policing gender. We are in the business of fighting the policing of gender. Feminism calls for the end of unjust patriarchy. Patriarchy is bigger than any man or any woman, and we are all, men and women, invested in patriarchy to varying degrees, and we all reap some of the fruits of patriarchy. Women, think carefully about the ways you yourself are invested in patriarchy. Do not presume that because you don't have a penis, you do not benefit from the patriarchal system. Patriarchy is more than masculine and male. In the global system, patriarchy is white. Patriarchy speaks English. Patriarchy is heteronormative, able-bodied, wealthy, and well-connected. As a woman, I know what it means to be disregarded, unvalued, sexually harassed, and groped on the bus. But I have no right telling a working-class queer man with brown skin and disabilities and the wrong accent, who went to the wrong school in the wrong neighborhood and whose parents have the wrong friends, that he doesn't know what it's like to be oppressed just because he has a penis and I don't. I would be a hypocrite not to acknowledge that I have benefited from patriarchy. I am invested in patriarchy. I have the same West Coast American accent as the movie stars, rock stars, broadcast journalists, celebrity politicians, and CEOs whose voices and image have colonized the developing world. I speak with power when I don't mean to because I'm so obviously from that country with the most funded military in the world. In sum, patriarchy has treated me pretty darn well, but because I can see the way it simultaneously disadvantages me, and more importantly, that it seriously hurts and harms literally billions of people, I am a feminist and I oppose patriarchal oppression and gender inequality. Thank you.
evening. Well, that was fun. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you for the invitation to everyone involved. Tonight, I think the other side of the house, indeed much of the house, has made something of a disadvantage. I've been invited to come here and, at least to an extent, tell you what feminism is, what feminism should be, even what feminism should do. I can no more tell the majority of you how to do your feminism than I can tell a Buddhist monk how to meditate, a brain surgeon how to operate, or a duck how to quack. I'm a man. It's not for me to define feminism, and it never should be. I can, if you like, tell you what I understand feminism to be from listening to my friends and opponents here tonight and to many other people. Something like a movement of women to liberate women from the political, social and personal oppressions of structural oppression. But I offer you that opinion with no authority, and I cannot. It's worth about as much as my opinion that, say, Yaya Toure should push further forward and create space for Sergio Aguero and the opposing defence. That's an opinion. It's true, by the way, but I don't expect anyone to take my word for it. And if I may extend my slightly tortured analogy a little bit further, feminism is somewhere where the players, and indeed the manager, has to be women, has to be a woman or women. The most I can ever be is a pundit in the studio or a supporter on the sidelines. Now, from my view in the stand, feminism is not an identity to be donned like a badge. It's not just something that one is or one aligns with, it's something one does. Feminism is a living, dynamic movement, and a lot of that dynamism surely comes from constant internal argument, debate, reform, discussion, dispute. I've worked out where that microphone is. If anyone thinks, by the way, that a world run by women or by feminists would be a place of peace and harmony and milk and honey forevermore, I suggest you spend some time amongst Twitter feminists. Because, believe me, feminists can argue. And when they do, it seems to me that I, or any man within feminism, is left in a position that either you stand there and tell half the women involved, I'm sorry, you're wrong, and I know better than you what feminism should be and what feminism should do, or else one attempts to meddle like a liberal vicar at a pub fight, saying, well, I'm sure you both make very good points, but can we not all just be nice to each other? I'm sorry, that's not my kind of activism. As we heard earlier, the He for She campaign was launched a few weeks ago. Where did it lead to? It led to a conference being planned in Iceland in January that's for men only. That can't be right, can it? And yet I think that is an inevitable consequence of asking men to take a lead in feminism. Similarly, it should acknowledge that there is, in fact, a fairly high profile, probably one of the most high profile feminist organizations in the world over the last 5 years or so, which is led, organized by a man. This man is the organization's spiritual or ideological guru. His name is Viktor Sviatsky. His organization is called Femin, and they've made the front pages all over the world by pushing their prettiest activists to the front and then getting their tits out for the cameras. Now, who could have possibly imagined that such a plan would be thought up by a man? Now, of course, not all male feminists are like that. Not all men. But my experience of male feminism is not exactly uncommon for those kind of attitudes to start to come through. So all things considered, women, feminists, if you wish to throw open the gates of your movement to men, I will respect that. I will wish you the best of luck, and I will politely decline your invitation. But that's not to say that I will withdraw from the fight against discrimination, against bigotry, against hatred, against misogyny, against every other kind of social injustice. I care as much as anyone, I hope, about tearing down the pillars of our viciously gendered society. But feminism is not and cannot be the only social justice game in town. In my work, and to a certain extent in my personal life as well, I try to help and support some of the men who are left bruised and battered by the restrictive manacles of our gendered society. And whatever issues I look at, I tend to find the same patterns coming up again and again. Take, for example, child or adult victims of sexual or domestic abuse. They too often do not get the help they need because both they themselves and society around them at large cannot fully conceive of men. Look at the boys and men who live with untreated physical and mental health issues, self-medicating their anxieties, and too often living with the consequences of that in addiction and social exclusion. Those boys are living as they do because neither they themselves nor society at large is prepared to conceive of men as weak or vulnerable. All of these problems, and many more, can be traced back to the same old oppressive social gender relations. The degree that which lifestyles, which behaviours, which attitudes are appropriate for men and for women, if you prefer, to patriarchy. But even if the slogan, the old feminist dictum, patriarchy hurts men too, is true, if you believe that, you accept it, surely that is for men ourselves to recognise, understand and address. The last time I checked, feminism had more than enough issues of their own, of women's, to be getting on with and sorting out, without sorting all men's problems out as well. Listen, guys, men, if I can speak to you for a minute, we have got enough problems of our own to sort out. I'm not saying that we need to set up within feminism as an alternative to feminism, but parallel and alongside feminism, and we can help each other and we can build the kind of world that we'd all like to see. Thank you.
We thank Ali for his fine speech and call upon Becky to continue the case of the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about three things today. The first is, can men really be feminists? Are they capable of doing so? Will they do it well? Will they do it right? Do we have the ability to tell them if they're doing it badly and wrong? Our answer to that, you can maybe guess, is going to be yes. The second is, will men make feminism better when they're there? Again, you can probably guess what I'm going to say on that one. And thirdly, what are the harms if we don't allow men into this movement and we try to keep them at arm's length? What happens to those men, or what happens to a large number of those men? So first off, can men really be feminists? Well, we've already heard from our side about the way in which many men themselves will experience much more oppression than I will as a white middle-class woman. To say that that man can then not empathise with the idea of oppression, who when they hear about the problems women are facing, can't say, well, I've had similar things myself. The circumstances may have been different, but I can understand and I want to campaign with you on those issues. To say that men aren't able to do that is insulting to those men, and we condemn it on this side of the House in this debate. We think that also inequality often really harms men as well. We think the idea of very feminine men is mocked or belittled by most in society. If you're a man who wants to go and wear a dress or paint your fingernails, probably you're going to get beaten. You're going to be attacked for the things that you want to do to express yourself in your own concept of what you feel it is to be a man. We think that that is a problem that feminism should be concerned with as well, because it's saying that traits that people consider to be feminine are wrong, are bad, and you shouldn't want to have them. We think it's important that those men are included in feminism. So what happens if those men are bad at doing it? If you've got a man who comes into feminism and says, oh girls, get your tits out, this is what we think feminism should be. We think feminism has grown up to the point that people are strong enough within feminism, as they do with groups like Femin, to call bullshit and say that this is a really bad thing to be doing, and that those people aren't real feminists. Just because you say you're a feminist doesn't mean that you are one, and doesn't mean the community has to accept you as one. But just because you have a penis doesn't mean that you aren't then able, or that you just identify as a man, doesn't mean that you are then unable to believe in and help feminism and understand those issues and campaign on them. Because you might have your own issues of oppression that allow you to have that understanding, or just be a very empathetic person. We think people are able to do it for that reason as well. Secondly, will men help advance feminism once they're there? So I've already talked to you about the sorts of men we think really, really suffer under the patriarchy. So those men who do want to wear dresses, who want to wear makeup, who want to do those sorts of things, but still want to be a man. Because those men exist, and we think that at the moment the system isn't too great for those people. But it's not only that, there are so many issues that affect women that are on the other side something that is bad for men. So if we look at, say, childcare, and the fact that women are assumed to be the ones who will provide it, and men are assumed to not be the ones who will provide it. If that is the assumption, and you don't talk to men and have them involved in the campaign to change that assumption, how do you hope to change that assumption when it's men who you need to convince to come out and feel able to go and look after their children? Because if they do, they're pretty often mocked by their colleagues, by their friends. We need to change that assumption, and we need men in that fight changing those presumptions for what is expected of both men and of women. So finally, I'm going to talk to you about what are the harms if we keep these men at arm's length, and all we do is do what this side would like and have them as allies and people who are allowed to support feminism but cannot be within it themselves. Why do we think this is harmful? So we think that some men will do this and will listen very carefully to the things that these women in these feminist groups are saying. They'll do all the things that Ali Fogg is doing, and they will support women wholeheartedly from the sidelines. We think it's great that those men are doing that, but not all men are going to do that. And this is where we see a really, really big problem. So we think there are two different other things that can happen to those men. One is when they first have an interest in feminism, but the feminists tell them, well, we're sorry, you can't be in our club, but you can come and support us if you'd like to help out on the side. Those men are then going to feel disengaged from that movement. It's not something they want to be a part of if they're not allowed to be a part of it fully and truly and contribute in the same way. Especially maybe if they are those men who feel that it's insulting to think that they can't understand the oppressions of women when they have them of their own as well. So we think that these men then disengage. But what we think is the best thing that feminism brings to people is consciousness raising, is getting them to understand that there is a problem right now. Because many women, just in society at large, do not realise the problems that they face on a day-to-day level. They don't realise the way in which subtly people treat them differently as women. Some women don't even realise that they're paid less than men. If those women aren't even realising it, how do we hope for men to realise the same as well? If we get them engaged in feminism and let them have that label, then it's become something that they want to find out more about, that they want to be engaged in. They then hang out with feminists, they talk to them, they get to know the things that are affecting their lives, and they then can do things to help change it themselves in the way that they act in society. So we think this is probably what will happen for an awful lot of men. Probably men in this room have felt that way when they've been confronted with feminism. And I can bet you that most of the women in this room will have read a lot more about feminism than the men in it. And I think this is a part of the reason for that. But also, we think that it's really easy for the extreme groups against feminism. We're talking about men's rights activists, or just all general people who like to give feminism that label, that it's only about women. It's about hating men. It's about getting women above men. We think that if you take this piece of fire away from those groups, this thing that they can point to and say, well, look, men, you're not allowed to be feminists. As we told you, it's not about your problems, even if they're part of the same system. It's just about those women and about getting things better for them. We think if we take away this piece of ammunition for those people, it then makes it much harder for them to go down the roads that they currently go down, to try to recruit people and try to paint feminism in the brush that it is now. What happens then? You get more and more people engaging in feminism, more men engaging in feminism, who are the ones we need to change the mind of. A lot of women, especially probably ones in this room, are converted. It's the men that we want on side with us as well. We want you to understand the problems we're facing and want to keep reading about it, listening to people who have experiences other than the ones that you've heard of already, and keep learning and become better feminists. If you do it badly, we're going to tell you you're shit. okay? You can't just be a feminist and never get called out on the times when you do things badly. We hope that you're up for trying to get better.
Yeah, I think intersectionality is really important. And people who don't know what intersectionality is, it's kind of like accepting that different forms of oppression affect different people. So, like, as a lot of people have pointed out, as a white middle class woman, I won't experience the same oppression as a black working class woman. I don't think that undermines feminism at all, and I don't think that means that we can't use intersectionality in our feminist movement. One of the strongest things about feminism at the moment, and what's been happening since a lot of black feminist thought has come out in the 90s, is the thought of intersectionality. And actually within feminism, you have something called caucuses a lot, where say queer women or black women or disabled women can get together and talk about what affects them as that kind of women. And as a whole, feminism tries to, good feminists, try to push forward voices that are more oppressed and have got different experiences and include them. There are also, feminism isn't the only liberation movement. There's a very, very strong politically black or BME liberation movement. There's a very, very strong disabled movement, and there's a very, very strong LGBTQ movement. They have their own autonomy as well, and autonomy is very, very important for liberation, because, as I said in my speech, the people in power and the people who are the structures of oppression can't be giving out rights, and they can, but it doesn't solve the problem because it's still their decision, and they're working in their own autonomous groups to claim back rights. There's solidarity between liberation groups, and there's collaborations when there's cross-liberation, there's a lot of campaigns put together, but I don't think I undermines it in any way.
Why not men? Why can't
Men fit into other liberation groups.
I think it's a really interesting question. The first thing that I'd say is that I feel that feminism is already lots of different movements, whether we use the name or not. I think we actually have two very different definitions of feminism. I think came from Jeff and I gave one definition, and Liberty gave quite a different one. I think the problem I have with the broader definition that feminism is basically the belief in gender equality, and quite a little wide, broad analysis, is it allows just about anyone to claim to be a feminist, including the likes of Mensch, who I believe put some political ideas that are really quite antithetical to women's interests. But even David Cameron, who's he's the man who's slashing women's aids refugees across the country, will still tell you he's a feminist because he's applying very broad definition. But I think that I would be quite happy with rejecting the proposition today if I thought we could go to a major feminist conference, Feminista UK or whatever other conference say, and say, okay, here's the room where we're going to be discussing men victims of sexual violence. Here's the room where we're going to be discussing how men are pushed into homelessness and addiction by the restrictions of alcohol and self-medication and so on and so forth. And I have yet to meet any prominent feminist that actually, when it comes down to the nuts and bolts, would be prepared to allow that to happen. And I think I kind of agree with the reasons why, because we get them on this side of the house together. And I think that's actually where the no side to tonight's debate falls down, when it actually comes down to that perception.
Okay, do either of you want to respond?
Well, I am a feminist sociologist. I've dedicated all of my work to the study of male infertility. I'd be very prepared to present at any gender conference on male infertility, which I have many times. So I don't buy that, but I wouldn't be welcome to present.
Not that you would be welcome. No, we would be welcome. Kelvin and I go off into the room and say, this is our part of feminist conference where we're going to discuss men. That's the point I'm making.
Oh, I think that's making an assessment, an assumption based on no facts. That's what I think.
So even if you don't have that, I still think that you should then still be a feminist, because even if the feminist conference isn't going to address male-specific issues outside of the general scope, first off, you could be campaigning for those women's issues and have a good, useful voice in that campaign, even if they aren't male-specific things. So I think you'd still be useful at a feminist conference, even if it didn't address specific issues only to men.
The other thing is that I feel like, so I understand that you have a different definition of feminism than we do, but it sounds like your definition is about activism, and activism that happens on social media and in journalism. And there are women who are activists by going to their neurology laboratory every day and showing up at work every day. I mean, that is their form of activism. They may not be marching in the streets and tweeting every 5 minutes, but they are absolutely, you know, involved in the feminist movement by getting on the subway and flipping off the guy that roasts them. So my thought is, I have a lot to say. Okay. So there was a comment that I think was made over here about how there are LGBT groups and there are groups for persons with disabilities and there are all these groups. I mean, I work as a feminist academic. I don't work in social media. I don't, you know, I'm not an activist in that way. But I will say that within academia, feminists see themselves absolutely aligned with all those groups. We see those as feminist thinking groups. I don't know any feminists who oppose the creation of an LGBT alliance or the creation of a you know, persons with disabilities rights group. I mean, I see feminism as being really quite unified within academia. We care about whether or not women are getting into the STEM, you know, the science, technology, math disciplines. I mean, I see feminism as being very unified. I don't really see feminism as being broken up or being different than these other rights groups. I also see feminists as being very committed to issues of ethnic and racial violence and, you know, all the civil rights issues and human rights issues that go on.
So I think in a lot of ways this is a problem with what you name the movement. So I think if we're working under our side's definition of feminism being about equality for everyone, it's just feminism is the word that people have been using. I'm happy with the level of history surrounding it to continue with that word. But even if we use that definition, that feminism is only about campaigning for women to get to that equality themselves, I'm still happy to say, from basically what I said before, that it's important for men to be involved in that movement to get those women equal rights as well. So either way, if people want to split it up themselves personally because they feel more comfortable in a group with only themselves in, then they can have a subset, that's fine.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, as someone who defined into our deliberation group as well, I actually find it quite offensive that you think that feminism can just be the equality for everyone and cover all rights. Like, actually, there are really important rights that we need for our deliberation groups that don't fall under feminism, and that, like, patriarchy isn't the only system of oppression, and we're just, it seems like we're ignoring that there are other groups that need their autonomy, and actually black men or queer men might not want like white middle class women in their movement either, and I completely accept that. I also think that it's quite the difference between like my definition of feminism and women claiming back rights isn't the only kind of gender structural gender inequality.
Like a 50% cap that you can't let it go. When we talk about LGBT issues, one of our opponents got a round of applause for mentioning how inclusive feminism is to trans women or trans people. We can't ignore the fact that some of the most prominent, important and influential feminists in Britain and across the world want to take the T off LGBT. They actually don't support transition at all. Feminism's record in this is not exactly pure as there is no. The other point that I would, I should have scribbled it down. No, I've lost it. It'll come back.
Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of your speech was about power structures, and now you're backpedaling and saying that these issues for persons with disabilities or issues for black men or whatever aren't part of that same power structure. And if you take my class, I'll tell you right now, it's all part of the same power structure.
Okay, sorry. Maybe I'll put it on.
Can I get one really important?
Very quick.
It's the bit that I forgot. I think that the problem I have, and I've got a slightly theoretical, ideological objection to calling myself a feminist, which I sort of explained earlier. But I do have to say, if someone draws the definition of feminism so broad that it includes Sarah Palin, that it includes Margaret Thatcher, that it includes David Cameron, that it includes Louise French, then you can definitely count me out, because I would not be involved with that. I think that's coming directly to me, so yeah. The way I see it, I broadly agree with the general point you're making. The way I see it, I actually don't think it's possible to address the specifics of men's issues, men's psychology, masculine and gender norms, and the female-women's equivalents in the same place at the same time. I think it just doesn't work, partly because, as Jess so eloquently explained, men do tend to literally and metaphorically open their legs so wide and take over everything that the women get squeezed out. But also I think that, as I said from the floor, I think men have to work this stuff out for ourselves, and I think we are probably about 50 years behind women in doing it. And while feminism provides men with a fantastic toolbox, all the implements and instruments and methodologies we possibly need to work out what the problems are and what the solutions may be. But I don't think we can just look to feminism, which is ultimately, the clues in the name, a women's movement, and say, please ladies, go sort out problems out for us. I don't think it works like that.
Yeah, I also think like I mentioned in my speech that masculinity and gender roles do affect men, and like you mentioned men finding it hard to talk about mental health problems. I cited there's quite a high suicide rate amongst men. It's a huge issue. I just don't think that the place to deal with that issue is in a women's rights movement. Like, and actually, if you allow women's rights movement to thrive, and it's dealing with what effectively is the negative connotations of femininity, which affect men as well, and if you deal with that and allow women to have some ownership of something, and allow them to kind of like work towards that, it will, as a byproduct, stop that as well. But that doesn't stop. There are campaigns going on about men's mental health separate to feminist issues. A lot of them are quite misogynist, but they're still out there and kind of like dealing with those issues. And I'm not saying that should be happening at all. I just don't think that I should give up something like a women's only space and like the power to empower women into taking back rights for themselves for that.
Thank you. Would either of you like to respond?
Sure. I think that and this might be coming back to how we differ in our definitions of feminism. But wherever men go to solve their problems, as you suggested, men should go and do this on their own. I do not see why they should do that without the toolkit that feminism can provide. Feminism has provided the concepts, the theories, the hard facts for them to figure out their problems and get their stuff together.
They can use those toolkits, they just don't need to invade.
So I guess my question is, how does that make them not feminist then? If they're using all of the feminist concepts, tools, theories, and research, and they're doing it just happens to be in a different space, they're going to now call it men's research? I mean, no, don't put a man label on it. Give women the credit for the research that's been done. Give feminism.
First off, I think that Jess is worried about losing women's only spaces. I think there should always be space in feminism, and I don't know if you agree or not, but for some of those spaces to exist. I'm fine with women to have women's only spaces. But that doesn't mean that there would be no room at the feminist conference for men, or that men can't have a feminist conference with no women in it, and it still be defined as feminism. We also heard from Ali about this kind of broad church, and him not liking if it's so broad that David Cameron is in it or whoever else. I have lots of male friends who are feminists, and sometimes they do it badly, and then I tell them that they're doing it badly, and I explain to them, and then they get a little bit better. Or maybe they disagree with me, and maybe they convince me that they aren't doing it badly. I mean, it's a discussion to be had there. But I think at any point that a man is shouting over women in a feminist discussion, that a bad feminist will be told as such.
Because what you're making it sound like is a competition of who's best.
That's exactly what I'm not saying. We should be having the Sexual Olympics, and that's what I was worried about what's happening with the opposition, where people are kind of like saying that feminism encompasses all rights, but it doesn't, because it then puts it above, it puts women's rights above race issues, it puts LGBTQ issues, it puts it above disabled issues. I don't think that's okay. It should be about gender, and also just while I'm on that point, I think that there might have been some issues with the idea of self-definition and whether if you have a penis, then you can't be in the feminist movement. Like, I strongly will back self-definition, and I'm not going to tell someone because they can't be involved in feminism. If someone tells me they define as a woman, they define as a woman. That's the end of that. Sorry. Did I answer your question? Sorry. Yeah. Cool. I forgot what I was asking.
I have a very brief point to it. I think there's some really interesting things earlier about expression are all interlinked and overlapping and often amount to the same thing when we're talking structural power. And I personally, just like disagree with it, personally I think men are oppressed, in the true sense of the word, by gender roles and by patriarchy, if you put it that way. However, cooperating in order to sort it, you just have to be very careful how you do it. I think it would be very inappropriate of me, as someone who is deeply, passionately opposed to racism, to claim to be an activist for black liberation. I think people in black community activism projects around the world might be a bit legitimately upsetting and put it that way. If I were to go in and say, right, I'm here to sort out your campaign for you, or even I'm here to join arm in arm in your campaign. And I think men and feminism is a very similar relationship there. That's not to say that there's not a broader civil rights campaign, there's not a broader campaign against racism, which everyone will do. Just as you do not need to be a feminist to identify as a feminist, to be opposed to sexism, to campaign against misogyny, to campaign against sexual violence or whatever else. The two things are not necessarily synonymous and they don't have to go together. Yes, we can cooperate, it doesn't mean it all has to be within the same tent.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
Well, I hear Mr. Fogg saying that I shouldn't have taken my children on the Freedom Ride. He said not arm in arm. And you know, I'm saying it's been 150 years since the Emancipation Proclamation and 50 years since the March on Washington, and whites still don't care. And until some whites will decide to listen, now did I show up and say, I'm going to be at the front of this parade? Heavens no. I said, we're here to learn, please teach us. And I think that, you know, I think the same thing can happen with gender. This does not have to be a battle of the sexes. This can be, let's link arm in arm, let's listen to each other, let's figure this out together.
So also I'd say in terms of what Jess brought up about us not thinking that BME and LGBTQ and disabled campaigns are important, obviously we do. And anyone who wants those campaigns and in the places in which they don't intersect at all with the patriarchy, there should be campaigns, people should do it, that's great. But in terms of just feminism in particular, if we don't talk about those specific other campaigns, I think that the patriarchy affects men in such a way that the men in here won't even probably realise, in the way in which they're never really able to express their emotions to people, in the way that their legs might look really badass in a dress, but they're not going to know. I think that these are things that men are affected by as well in a way that is kind of different, at least to what I know about the problems that BME people face, that I don't think white people have the same kind of problems within that system. I think that's probably fair to say is what men do have within the patriarchy, so I think it's worth them being part of the movement and to know that they're being oppressed as well. I think that's kind of a really important point.
To finish off, I'd quite like to make just a distinction between a feminist ally and a feminist supporter, and someone who will support gender equality and support the feminist aims, and someone who is involved in the women's movement and is on the front lines and is going to men's dominated spaces and kind of being there and like just physically putting themselves there and deciding on what issues that women should be campaigning on and feminists should be campaigning on. I don't think I think men can do the first. I don't think they should be doing the latter, and I think they make the decisions in pretty much everywhere else in society, and I don't want them to come into feminism and tell me what I should care about as a woman. In terms of what you just said, Becky, and Liberty as well, I think there's also a very important difference between supporting feminism and educating yourself. Like going on the freedom ride, that's educating yourself and supporting something. It's not you sitting in a room and deciding, hey guys, we should go on a freedom ride to show to kind of like campaign. They're very different things, and no one's telling you shouldn't educate yourself and you shouldn't educate your children about oppression. It just means that you should be deciding what's the most important what's the most important oppression that we should be dealing with if it doesn't affect you personally. Let me just quickly look over my. Yeah, I'm not sure if I liked the whole like real feminists, and I think like while I think that like within the women's movement there's a lot of different kinds of feminism, and we should kind of embrace them all, as long as kind of like everyone has a right to define their own feminism. I don't think men have a right to define their own feminism. A woman like Margaret Thatcher would definitely not be in my feminism, but she can have her own because she has faced oppression as a woman. I don't necessarily agree with anything she'll ever say, but that doesn't mean that I can say that she has no right to say it. Yeah, and I just want to. Yeah, that's fine.
And invite Dr. Barnes to make the case for the opposition. Thank you.
Okay, so a few points. One, I'd like to just reiterate that the power structure that we keep talking about is patriarchy, and all forms of oppression link back to patriarchy. Even the forms of oppression that the patriarch of your own family experiences is patriarchy. And then my next question is, where are all these men? I mean, the feminist movement started over 100 years ago, and we keep hearing this big threat that men are going to take over the movement. The hand has been extended, the invitation has been extended, and we still can't find them. I still go to gender conferences and there is one gay guy and all women. I don't, and I'm telling you right now that if a man showed up and tried to take over, he would not be successful in a room full of feminists. And unfortunately, the men's rights movements that I see happening, there are only two kinds. The first is the men's movement that is becoming more prominent right now is about the fighting back against feminism and about men being emasculated, and we have to reclaim our masculinity and our strength. And that is not a safe kind of men's movement. The second kind of men's movement that's going on right now is being led by men who do self-identify as feminists. They take the time to keep up with the feminist literature, to follow feminism, and to learn what they need to learn. Is that it? Is that 2 minutes? So, you know, basically in sum, I'll say I found it a bit cringeworthy that the UN campaign for women's rights is called #HeForShe. But now the wake-up call has been sounded and the invitation has been extended. And I promise you that this is the only personal invitation most of you in this room will ever receive from Emma Watson. So men, accept the invitation. There is room for you on this freedom ride, and there is strength in numbers.